April 28, 1994, DeKalb County, Georgia, started like nothing serious until two cars touched lightly inside a restaurant parking lot. Then voices rose as tension built around a small scratch that should have ended quick. Anthony Maclin stood there with his fiancée trying to sort things out, yet the other two men, Jameswhite and Devon Brown, kept pressing him not to call police, which made the situation feel off. The argument stretched just long enough for nerves to tighten. Then a gun came into view, shifting everything from talk to survival within seconds, as witnesses later described panic hitting fast. Maclin dropped after shots rang out near close range, and while details stayed scattered at first, officers would later confirm he died from those wounds. What happened in that lot looked small from the outside, yet that moment didn't begin there, since it closed out a story already moving across cities for years. When police released Richard Jameswhite's photo in September 1993, the first thing that caught attention wasn't violence. It was how young he looked, since reports described him as about 5 feet tall with a face that could easily pass for a middle school kid. That image stayed consistent across newspapers like the New York Times and Daily News, where writers kept pointing out that his physical appearance did not align with the severity of the cases being discussed. At the same time, detectives in Brooklyn were linking him to a growing number of shootings across East Flatbush and nearby areas, which created a disconnect between what people saw and what authorities were saying. As those reports circulated, people in the neighborhood reacted with skepticism at first, since it seemed unlikely that someone so small could be tied to multiple violent incidents without drawing immediate attention. However, that disbelief started fading once specific names began appearing in connection with investigations, including Javier Avila, Omar D., and Fitzroy Reed, which gave the story more weight beyond general claims. While none of those cases had yet formed a complete public narrative, the repetition of his name across separate incidents made it harder to dismiss the possibility that one person was involved in all of them. At the same time, law enforcement descriptions emphasized how unpredictable he appeared during encounters, with some reports stating he was quick to react in tense situations, which contributed to the growing concern among officers handling the case. That characterization added another layer to the contrast, since it suggested a level of behavior that did not match his physical presence, reinforcing the sense that something about the situation did not fit normal expectations. As that perception spread, it began shaping how both the public and investigators approached the case moving forward. The number attached to his name also played a role in how the story developed, since authorities began referring to him as a suspect in up to 15 killings across multiple states, although not all of those cases had been proven in court. That figure moved through media coverage quickly, creating an impression that extended beyond confirmed facts and into broader speculation about the extent of his involvement. From that point, the gap between documented evidence and reported claims became part of the story itself, which made it necessary to look back at the environment he came from in order to understand how his name reached that level of attention. To place Richard Jameswhite properly, you have to look at Flatbush, Brooklyn, during the early 1990s, when New York City recorded over 2,200 homicides in 1990 alone, marking one of the highest peaks in its history. In neighborhoods like East Flatbush, gunshots were not rare events, since the crack trade had already reshaped daily life, turning corners, storefronts, and apartment blocks into active spots tied to money and conflict. That shift mattered since disputes that once stayed physical started ending in shootings, especially as firearms became easier to access among young crews trying to control territory. Teenagers found themselves pulled into that structure early, since age didn't protect anyone from being involved in disputes tied to drug money or street reputation. Within that setup, the Parkside area near Prospect Park became one of the zones tied to crews operating in that environment, where small groups focused on robbing drug dealers rather than running full operations themselves. That approach created constant risk, since targets were armed, retaliation came fast, and trust rarely lasted long between different groups. For young guys coming up there, respect didn't come from talk. It came from action, which meant violence quickly turned into a kind of currency that defined status within those circles. Over time, that pattern made it normal for names to spread through blocks based on what someone had done rather than who they were before. That setting is where Jameswhite's story really starts making sense, since what happened next didn't come out of nowhere. It followed a turning point tied to someone close to him. Before the name BABYFACE started circulating through police reports, there was another name tied closely to his story, and that was his older brother, Glester Jameswhite, who was killed on January 28, 1991, in East Flatbush near Caton Avenue and Ocean Avenue. That shooting did not come with clear answers in public records, which meant details around motive, suspects, or exact circumstances stayed uncertain, leaving space for street talk to take over where facts were missing. As those rumors moved through the neighborhood, one name kept coming up in conversations, and that was Kevin Smith. A 19-year-old man, Richard James White, came to believe played a role in his brother's death. That belief pushed him into action within weeks, since on February 19, 1991, he walked into a barbershop on Lenox Road and opened fire on Smith, who survived the shooting even though the attack made clear this was personal. Police arrested Jameswhite shortly after that incident, charging him with attempted murder, which at that point looked like it could stop everything early if the case held. Instead, a judge set bail at $5,000, which allowed him to return to the streets while waiting for trial, creating a window that changed the direction of everything that followed. When his court date came later in 1991, he did not show up, which shifted him from a defendant into a fugitive, placing him outside the system while still carrying unresolved charges tied to the shooting. That move mattered, since it removed any structure holding him in place, leaving him to move through Brooklyn without legal oversight while still carrying that original motive tied to his brother's death. From there, what started as a single act tied to revenge no longer stayed contained, since being on the run forced him into a different way of living that kept him moving constantly. Once that shift happened, the story stopped looking like one incident, since everything began accelerating in ways that connected to the environment he was already part of. After missing court and disappearing from the system, Richard Jameswhite had to survive without stability, which led him into closer association with the group police, later identified as the Parkside Boys, a small crew operating around the south end of Prospect Park in Brooklyn. This group was not a large organization with hierarchy or structure, since reports described it as a handful of young men moving together loosely, relying on quick decisions rather than long planning. Their main strategy centered on robbing drug dealers, which placed them in direct conflict with people already armed and involved in illegal operations, raising the level of danger with every move they made. That approach made them different from crews focused on territory control or distribution, since robbing dealers created constant retaliation risks, meaning every job could trigger another conflict within days or even hours. As that cycle continued, staying in one place became difficult, which forced constant movement across neighborhoods, sometimes even outside Brooklyn, as pressure built from both police attention and street retaliation. Within that unstable pattern, reputation started becoming more important than anything else, since survival often depended on how others perceived your willingness to act quickly under pressure. Detectives later gathered information suggesting Jameswhite became focused on that reputation. with some reports stating he paid attention to how many killings were being attributed to others, which created a competitive mindset tied to status rather than just survival. Around the same time when police searched his apartment, they found over 200 VHS tapes, including films like Lethal Weapon and Dirty Harry, which showed a pattern of consuming content centered on gunfighters operating outside traditional rules. That detail raised questions among investigators about whether those images influenced how he saw himself, since the line between real actions and constructed identity appeared to blur as his time on the run continued. As those elements combined, including constant movement, exposure to violence, and growing attention from both police and the streets, his name began circulating more frequently in connection with shootings happening across Brooklyn during 1992 and into 1993. At that point, the shift from survival to notoriety was already underway, which meant the next phase of the story would not rely on speculation alone, since investigators were starting to connect specific cases directly to him. By early 1992, investigators in Brooklyn started seeing patterns that were not obvious at first, since individual shootings across Flatbush and nearby areas were common during that period and often treated as separate incidents. One of the earliest names police later connected to Richard Jameswhite was Javier Avila, a 22-year-old man killed on March 29, 1992 in Brooklyn, although public details around that case remained limited. As the year continued, another killing followed on August 24, 1992, when Omar D., aged 27, was shot and killed, with the detectives later placing that case within the same developing pattern. At that stage, these incidents were not widely linked in public, since each case carried its own context tied to disputes, street conflicts, or unknown triggers, which made it difficult for outsiders to see a single thread connecting them. However, inside police units, names, locations, and timelines began lining up in ways that suggested one individual could be involved across multiple scenes. That process moved into early 1993, when Fitzroy Reed, aged 21, was killed on January 6th, adding another name to the growing list tied to the same circle of activity. What made this sequence important was not just the number of victims, but how each event contributed to a reputation building quietly within the neighborhoods where these incidents occurred. Word traveled faster than official reports, so even before police confirmed links, people in East Flatbush and surrounding blocks started hearing the same name connected to different shootings. Some cases appeared tied to disputes within street groups, while others did not have clear explanations available in public reporting, which allowed speculation to fill in the gaps where facts were still developing. As that pattern continued into 1993, police began treating these cases as part of a broader investigation rather than isolated events, which marked a shift in how they approached the situation. Detectives started compiling timelines, comparing witness accounts, and connecting individuals seen around multiple incidents, gradually building a picture that pointed toward Jameswhite. At the same time, the wider public still did not fully grasp the scale of what investigators were seeing, since most of these killings had not yet been tied together openly in the media. While all of this was happening, Jameswhite remained on the street, moving through Brooklyn without being captured, which added pressure to the investigation as more time passed without an arrest. Each additional case strengthened the perception that he was operating freely despite increasing attention, which in turn elevated his reputation within certain circles where survival under pressure carried weight. That momentum set the stage for a moment that would push his name beyond local awareness, since the next incident did not stay contained within quiet police work. On May 1st, 1993, in Flatbush near Ocean Avenue and St. Paul's Court, an incident took place that shifted how Richard Jameswhite's name was viewed, since it combined multiple elements that made it stand out immediately to both witnesses and investigators. According to reports later published by the New York Times, he positioned himself on the handlebars of a bicycle while another person pedaled, which created a moving platform that allowed him to approach a group without drawing immediate suspicion. As the bicycle moved through the area, he opened fire using 2 separate firearms, hitting multiple individuals within a short span of time, which resulted in the deaths of Ryan Cambridge, age 18, and Dodson Sparman, age 21, while 2 others were wounded. The structure of that attack made it difficult for people who saw it to process what had happened, since the method itself appeared unstable, yet effective enough to cause significant harm within seconds. Witness accounts describe confusion during the shooting, since the setup did not resemble a typical drive-by or confrontation, which contributed to the shock surrounding the event. Once details began circulating, the unusual nature of the incident quickly became part of how the story was told, since the image of someone firing 2 weapons while balancing on a bicycle stood out even in a period marked by frequent violence. Media coverage picked up on that aspect, repeating the details as they reported on the killings, which helped push the story beyond local conversations into broader attention across New York. As newspapers began connecting this incident to earlier cases, the narrative around Jameswhite started shifting from a suspected shooter to a figure associated with a series of killings that followed a recognizable pattern. That shift also increased pressure on law enforcement, since the visibility of the case meant the investigation could no longer remain within internal channels without public scrutiny. At the same time, the story took on a different kind of weight in the streets, since the method used in that shooting became part of how his reputation was discussed among those familiar with the environment. The focus moved away from individual incidents and toward the overall image of someone operating in ways that seemed unpredictable, which amplified both fear and attention. As his name spread beyond specific neighborhoods, the combination of confirmed details and circulating accounts began forming a larger narrative that extended past Brooklyn. That momentum carried directly into the next event, which would take the situation out of street conflicts entirely and place it into a setting that affected people with no connection to those disputes. On April 16, 1993, a Friday morning in Flatbush started like any other workday as people moved through Church Avenue, handling routine errands while businesses opened across the block near 1908 Church Avenue, with commuters, store owners, workers, and delivery traffic all moving through the area in a steady morning rhythm. Robert Singleton, a 38-year-old New York City Transit Authority iron worker, stopped there with co-workers to cash their paychecks before heading toward a maintenance site, which placed him in the area without any connection to street activity. As he stepped away to grab coffee from a nearby luncheonette, an armored truck from Coin Devices Corporation arrived carrying about $101,000, setting the stage for a planned robbery already in motion. According to reports from that day, multiple armed men positioned themselves around the location, waiting for the right moment as guards began moving cash toward the check cashing business. The setup unfolded quickly once a gunman stepped forward and opened fire on the guards, which triggered an immediate response from the armored truck personnel, turning the street into an active shooting scene within seconds. Additional shooters joined from across the street, increasing the volume of gunfire as more than 25 shots were exchanged in a short span, which pushed people nearby to dive for cover or run into buildings. As bullets moved through the area, the situation spread beyond the intended target, striking vehicles, storefronts, and bystanders who had nothing to do with the robbery attempt. During that exchange, Robert Singleton was hit in the head while walking back with coffee, collapsing on the sidewalk before any assistance could reach him, and he died at the scene shortly after. Other individuals were also wounded, including a taxi driver and one of the attackers, which added to the confusion as the group attempted to retreat without securing any money. The robbery failed completely, since guards managed to retain control of the cash by returning it to the armored truck during the exchange, leaving the attackers with nothing except the aftermath of the shooting. What remained instead was a public scene that extended beyond the usual boundaries of street disputes, since a civilian death shifted the focus from internal conflicts to broader safety concerns across the neighborhood. That change mattered, since incidents tied to drug disputes rarely reached this level of visibility during daytime hours on a busy street. From that point forward, the story around Richard Jameswhite moved into a different space, since the combination of a failed robbery and a civilian death brought attention that could not be contained within local circles. Reports began emphasizing how someone tied to multiple violent incidents could now be connected to a public shooting that affected everyday people, which expanded both awareness and concern. As that attention grew, another layer started forming around his identity, since details about his behavior and beliefs began circulating alongside the facts already under investigation. As reports about Richard Jameswhite spread through Brooklyn during 1993, another element began attaching itself to his story, since police and media sources described claims that he believed he had protection through spiritual practices connected to Jamaica. According to statements attributed to investigators, he told people he had traveled there to seek help from a practitioner of Obeah, which is a system of spiritual belief rooted in Afro-Caribbean traditions. Alongside those claims, accounts also mentioned that he wore a clove of garlic as a protective charm, which became part of how people described his behavior during that period. Whether those beliefs were fully genuine or partly used to build an image remains unclear, yet their impact on the surrounding environment became noticeable as stories about invisibility and protection began circulating through neighborhoods. In areas where fear already influenced how people responded to violence, the idea that someone could not be easily stopped added another layer that affected how witnesses reacted to events. That influence showed up in the reluctance of some individuals to cooperate with police, since speaking against someone believed to be unpredictable carried its own risks. As these accounts continued to spread, the narrative around Jameswhite expanded beyond confirmed incidents, blending verified details with stories that reinforced his reputation. That combination created a situation where perception began shaping reality, since even unconfirmed elements contributed to how his name was received across different communities. At the same time, law enforcement agencies were working to separate fact from rumor while continuing to track his movements across multiple locations. This growing mix of confirmed cases, reported allegations, and circulating stories pushed authorities to respond more aggressively, since the situation was no longer limited to isolated incidents within one borough. As attention increased, coordination between agencies expanded, setting the stage for a broader effort to locate and arrest him before additional incidents could occur. By September 1993, the investigation around Richard Jameswhite reached a point where police could no longer keep details internal, so the NYPD held a press conference and publicly identified him as a suspect tied to multiple killings across Brooklyn. That move pushed his name into newspapers like the New York Times and Daily News, where his mugshot circulated widely, creating a direct contrast between his boyish appearance and the violence described in official statements. While those images spread, authorities also sent alerts to other cities including Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Rochester, Washington, D.C., and even Toronto, since reports suggested he had connections allowing him to move beyond New York. As the search expanded, sightings began coming in from different locations, some confirmed and others unverified, which added to the difficulty of tracking someone already familiar with moving between neighborhoods. During one attempted stop in Brooklyn, officers approached a stolen Acura Legend believed to be driven by him. Yet when they moved in, gunfire broke out and he escaped, pushing the situation further into the high-risk category. That same encounter led into a pursuit where the vehicle lost a wheel, yet he continued driving on the rim for several blocks before getting away, which became one of the incidents often repeated in reports about his evasive behavior. At the same time, family members were drawn into the situation publicly as his grandmother made a plea through media outlets asking him to turn himself in, which highlighted how the case had reached beyond police work into personal spaces. Community reactions stayed mixed, since some residents expressed fear tied to the ongoing violence, while others, influenced by street culture, viewed his ability to avoid capture as a form of status. That dual perception added complexity to the search, since cooperation from witnesses was not always consistent in areas where distrust of law enforcement already existed. As agencies across multiple states coordinated efforts, the investigation shifted from a local manhunt into a broader operation aimed at locating him wherever he surfaced next. That buildup of pressure continued into early 1994, setting the stage for an ending that did not come from a planned raid or extended surveillance, but from a situation that started with something far less significant. The story returns to April 28, 1994 in DeKalb County, Georgia, where Richard Jameswhite and Devon Brown were involved in a minor collision with Anthony Maclin and his fiancée in the parking lot of a restaurant along Memorial Drive. What began as a dispute over a damaged fender escalated when Brown repeatedly urged Maclin not to call police, which indicated both men were aware of the consequences of any official involvement. As the argument continued, Maclin's fiancée attempted to move toward a phone, while Jameswhite briefly left the scene to try to gather money, suggesting they were trying to resolve the situation without outside attention. According to testimony later presented in court, the confrontation shifted suddenly when the fiancée turned and saw Brown holding a firearm while Jameswhite restrained Maclin, which marked the moment the situation moved beyond negotiation. Brown fired first, striking Maclin, and after he fell, Jameswhite fired again at close range, which forensic evidence later confirmed through ballistic analysis presented during trial. Maclin died from those injuries, ending the confrontation in a way that connected back to the pattern investigators had been describing for months. Following the shooting, both men fled in a vehicle before abandoning it and attempting to escape on foot, yet police located them shortly after near an apartment complex where Jameswhite was taken into custody without further incident. Officers recovered 2 firearms and a switchblade knife, and later testing connected one of those weapons to the shooting, providing key physical evidence for prosecution. Brown was also arrested, which allowed authorities to move forward with charges tied directly to the Georgia incident rather than earlier cases still under investigation elsewhere. The trial began in December 1994, where prosecutors focused on the events in the parking lot, presenting eyewitness testimony from Maclin's fiancée along with forensic evidence linking the weapons to the crime scene. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the case, including witness reliability and procedural issues, yet the court allowed the evidence to stand, which shaped how the jury evaluated the sequence of events. After deliberation, both Jameswhite and Brown were convicted of malice murder on December 12, 1994, and each received a life sentence, which was later upheld by the Georgia Supreme Court in 1997. That conviction marked the point where his freedom ended. Yet, it is important to note that this outcome came from the Georgia case, not from the earlier killings linked to him in Brooklyn or other states. Many of those cases remained untried in court, meaning the legal record confirms one murder conviction, while other allegations stayed within investigative and reporting frameworks rather than final verdicts. Names like Javier Avila, Omar D., Fitzroy Reed, Ryan Cambridge, Dodson Sparman, Robert Singleton, and Anthony Maclin remain part of the documented narrative, though not all were addressed through courtroom proceedings tied directly to him. This difference between confirmed conviction and reported involvement creates a gap that continues to shape how his story is understood, since reputation often expanded beyond what could be proven within legal standards. The image of a young man connected to multiple killings across states remains tied to both verified evidence and accounts that were never fully resolved in court. That leaves a final question hanging over the entire story, since even after the arrest, trial, and life sentence, the full extent of what he did versus what was attributed to him has never been completely settled.